I, Nikita Vats, have the honor to extend a warm welcome to all those who are present here on behalf of Defense Research and Studies. It is indeed my esteemed privilege to present this welcome note and to call to order this honorable panel of experts. My hearty warm welcome to all our beloved panelists, Commodore Naresh Kumar, Vishisht Seva Medal, Commodore S.L. Deshmukh, Nausena Medal, and Commodore G. Prakash, Nausena Medal. Commodore Naresh Kumar has served the Indian Navy for 33 years. He has served in all the three professional directorates of Naval Headquarters, New Delhi. He has served in naval dockyards at Mumbai as well as Vizag. Post-retirement, he has served as CMD Hindustan Shipyard Limited, Vizag, in Pipavav Defence and Senior Executive Vice President in Reliance Defence. He joined IIT Jammu as OSD in 2017 and is currently Senior Advisor IIT Jammu. His core areas of interest are in C4I, secured communication networks, network-centric warfare, and underwater systems. Our next speaker is Commodore S.L. Deshmukh. He has served Indian Navy for 32 years. He is an engineer qualified on both marine and aviation domains. He has served on aircraft carriers and is specialized in both fighter aircraft and anti-submarines warfare helicopters. He was Principal Director at Naval Headquarters, Commodore Superintendent, Naval Aircraft Yard and Director, Naval Institute of Aeronautical Technology. Post-retirement from Indian Navy, he was with Tata Group for 5 years and is currently working with Sun Group's Aerospace and Defence Vertical as Senior Vice President. Our next panelist is Commodore G. Prakash. He has served the Indian Navy for 36 years. He is a specialist in air warfare and anti-submarine warfare. He has had the honor of commanding 3 warships and 4 naval bases. He has also served at the Naval Headquarters, New Delhi. He has vast experience in operations, training, policy making, and human resource management. He has been lecturing over last 15 years on national security, doctrine and strategy, military history, leadership, and has conducted many sessions at the National Defense College, the War Colleges, at the College of Defense Management, corporate bodies, universities, and colleges. I'm also honored to introduce our moderator today, Divya Malhotra. Divya is pursuing her PhD from School of International Studies, JNU, and is a non-resident fellow at Middle East Institute, New Delhi. She completed her MA in Economics from Christ University and MPhil from JNU, New Delhi. She is a young and dynamic scholar on South Asia geopolitics and military affairs. I also take this opportunity to welcome all senior advisors of DRAS who are present here to attend our panel discussion. We also welcome all our senior fellows and my fellow researchers of Defense Research and Studies and all the guests who have graced us with their presence here today. May I now request Divya to start the proceedings. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Nikita, and a very good evening, everyone. It is an honor to be moderating the first session of the year for DRAS. We have entered 2021 with the problems of 2020. The world has been reeling from a pandemic which has degraded much of the world's economy and progress. In addition to all the other threats, the rise of Chinese threat has compelled India to review its defense strategy, including in the maritime domain. So the focus of today's talk would be to deliberate upon the challenges facing the Indian Navy in consolidating its position as the foremost navy in the Indian Ocean region. Without further ado, let's start with the first round. My first question is to Commodore G. Prakash. So Commodore Prakash, as per your assessment, what are the broader settings which the Indian Navy will have to manage as it takes on the challenges for the next decade?
Thank you, Nikita, and thank you, Divya. It's a great pleasure to be here. My greetings to all the members of DRAS and all the senior advisors and young researchers and other participants. We are talking about 10 years, entire decade. That's good enough a period over which we can consider how we change the way we fight, we organize, how we function, and actually make those changes also. It's good enough for time. So hence, I will keep it at the macro level. The broader settings which the Indian Navy will have to manage as it takes on its challenges for the next decade. There are external and internal factors. I will go to the external factors first. Now, the active hostilities that Pakistan and China are engaged in now, I don't think is going to abate in the next 10 years. That's basically because in Pakistan's case, their basic dysfunctionality and the stranglehold of the army over the country isn't in any way poised to change in the next 10 years. And that is a hostility that will persist. And as for China, the President Xi's quest for power again, and his own internal conflicts, the opposition that he faces, and the relative decline of the United States when compared to them and their relative rise, actually makes it quite evident that the hostilities are likely to stay here. Nothing may be getting resolved very soon. So that is as far as our adversaries are concerned. Now, as for the rest of the world, we are currently seeing those terrible happenings in USA, an insurrection virtually led by the president himself. Only time can tell how much the USA has lost out geopolitically in the last 4 years. And we've been seeing this manifestations in many parts of the world, especially the Middle East. And so how much we can actually depend on other countries for our problems is debatable. China behaves the way they do from a position of strength. Now, unless we attain that kind of economic strength, we need to be realistic about what we can achieve. Now, that's so much for external things. But above all this, actually, I will place 3 internal things, which have been, some of which have been spoken at the very highest level in this country by the Navy. I will put it as 3 factors, internal, which are actually the most important ones. First is getting this country to be seriously, deeply maritime conscious. Second is having a national security strategy. And finally, matching motives and means. Now, I will expand a bit on all 3. Now, as for maritime consciousness, considering our geography and the deep association that our oceans have had with our history, the only time when people came and actually subjugated us and sucked us over wealth and went away was through the oceans. And anything good happens actually through the oceans in this country. And this is, and that lack of serious maritime consciousness is, despite having had, good slogans and catchy phrases and concepts with direct association with the oceans for many decades. Many governments have had all that, but then we still need to be more maritime conscious. As they say, to be a maritime power, you need a good functional navy, a fighting navy, a good merchant marine, and you got to have good ports, infrastructure, laws, and all that. 500 years ago, when the Portuguese came here, we had the second 2, but we didn't have a good fighting navy. Today, we have a good fighting navy, but then we got to really look at the other 2 aspects. Now, as for national security strategy, I think the main gain is that of having that strategy is that it allows the best utilization of the available money, informs every agency what its role is and responsibilities are in the defense of the nation. And that allows focused creation of capacities, as this requires time and money. And it is not the army or the navy or the air force that goes to war. It is the country that goes to war. Now, every entity in a country that goes to war has a role to play in the waging of that war. Now, a national security strategy document draws up this comprehensive view. And the third is matching of motives and means. The motives, that means what we want to do, what we want to achieve, are dictated by external threats, a clear understanding of the Navy's responsibilities, and that, of course, flows from the overall national security strategy, available force structure in quality and quantity, available military institutional structure, quality of available personnel, infrastructure, training, and security tie-ups with other countries, etc. Now, means, those are the motives that actually define your motives. But means are dictated by assured funding support, domestic industrial capacities, availability of technical capabilities, and assured availability of resources of all types, including human resources. Now we have to move from a buyer's navy to builder's navy, and all that's correct. We have done a good job at design, building, operations, and maintenance of platforms. But these are mostly only in platforms and mainly in ships and submarines. We have not done well at all in aircraft. And we have also not done well in weapons and sensors, forcing us to resort to import. Now, all the time we hear of military modernization. And this modernization is mainly hijacked by a pursuit of technology. Now, technology doesn't win wars. I'm deeply skeptical about this. If technology was all that mattered, the United States wouldn't have been leaving Afghanistan after 20 years of laboring there with nil victory to show. But that is another story. We need to raise our narrative beyond technology and actually concentrate on the macro, external, and internal issues that I told you. Divya.
Thank you, Commodore Prakash, for highlighting the external constraints and the internal challenges within which the Indian Navy will have to posit itself. The context, as you said, is certainly important, and perhaps the maritime consciousness is missing. Our knowledge of the waters is shallow. Moreover, your observation about reliance on alliances is also interesting, and we might have more to discuss on this in the Q&A. Moving on to the next question for Commodore Naresh. Commodore Naresh, trying to gauge the technology quotient. How do you think can technology contribute to the Indian Navy in meeting its challenges in the coming decade? And what are our main strengths and weaknesses, and how can we address those?
Thank you, Divya. First of all, good evening, everybody. And thanks to Team Daras for giving me this honor. Commodore Prakash has brought out the naval perspective for the Navy in the coming decade. Let me start to say that when I joined the Navy in 1973, we had only ex-Royal Navy ships and Russian ships. Naturally, all the weapons and sensors in these ships were made in those countries. Navy over the last 50 years has completely transformed and have all ships and submarines, including an aircraft carrier, made in our yard. About 40 of them are under construction at present to replace the old ships. Navy has also indigenized most of the weapons and sensors used on board ships through DRDO, DPSUs, and private industry. We do have delays, and it leads to import of some of the critical systems from abroad to meet the operational requirements and production schedule. Briefly, all the communications and electronic warfare systems have been designed in the country, except for software-defined radio, which is under development by many of the local industry people. All underwater systems, that is sensors as well as weapons, have been indigenized by DRDO at NPUL and NSTL, and these are being produced by Bharat Electronics. I was fortunate enough in my young days to be part of the development of the best sonar system in those days, Sonar EPSO, with Dr. Paul Raj as a team leader. A range of missile systems have also been developed by DRDO and have completed trials. BrahMos, jointly developed by us with Russia, is a standard fit on our frontline ships. The most critical systems on board ship, the command and control system, which is integrated to all ship's weapons and sensors, has been jointly developed by WESI and Bell. This was a technology acquisition program from Salenia, Italy in mid-80s, and I was fortunate enough to be part of that program. Navy is also having its own data link and GSA-7 naval satellite for communication, which enables networking of all ships and aircrafts in the Indian Ocean region. You name a technology, it is used in the naval system. In fact, I would propose that most of our young engineers coming out of IITs and leading institutes in the country must visit a modern warship or a submarine to understand what is the technological level which is used by defense forces, rather than going to Microsoft and Amazon for marketing. Today is an era of disruption technologies, and unmanned systems and smart sensors and weapons are being used in air, surface, and underwater warfare. We are still developing these systems and have imported UAVs, P-8I AVAX, and recently Sea Guardian drone to meet our immediate operational requirements at sea. The technological landscape is changing at a very fast pace, and unmanned platforms with smart sensors and weapons using optical, infrared, and laser systems are the weapons of the day in the network-centric warfare. Our agencies, that is DRDO and industry, is working at it. Unfortunately, our neighbor in the north is far ahead in these technologies, and it's a challenge of the decade for India to develop and match up with them. Our leaders have made Atmanirbhar Bharat and self-reliance in defense policy very clear to Navy and to the industry. And I hope DRDO and industry, with guidance from defense services, can meet the objective set by the leaders, by the nation.
Thank you, Commodore
I
Naresh.
would like to leave you with the thought that if we can produce COVID vaccine in a year at par with the world, why can't we develop the new technological and systems required by the Navy to match our adversaries? Thank you.
Thank you, Commodore Naresh. You have very well underscored the relevance of technology and how the technological landscape is evolving, thereby compelling us to reassess our priorities. Now, taking the discussion further, can you elaborate about the new force multipliers that technology provides for future warfare?
Yeah, as brought out earlier by me, the emerging technologies of unmanned air, surface, and underwater platforms having smart sensors and weapons are evolving at a very fast pace. The smart sensors and weapons can detect and track objects over long ranges and send the real-time picture and videos to the command network for threat assessment and taking appropriate actions. The weaponized platforms can destroy the target with precision weapons having pinpointing accuracy. Recent operations by US forces using weaponized drones attack in many conflict zones have shown the new fighting paradigm with least risk to their own forces. The emerging communication technologies, software-defined radios, satellite networks have changed the warfare doctrine completely. The cloud computing applications using artificial intelligence, data analytics, geospatial data transmission, and accurate navigation guidance, remote targeting using lightning smart ammunitions is a new paradigm. Unmanned platforms, space-based communications and surveillance, artificial intelligence and machine learning, virtual reality, high energy weapons, GPS navigation and guidance, 5G and 6G high-speed communication networks, smart sensors and robotic technologies are the force multipliers to build new systems and upgrade existing ones. Harnessing of these emerging technologies is inescapable to face our adversaries. We have Defense Artificial Intelligence Project Agency, we have Defense Cyber Agency, Special Forces Command, and many other think tanks to develop these capabilities. Their objectives should culminate into reality. However, I feel that the Navy should lay its priorities to make headway. Thank you. Thank you, Devya.
Thank you, Commodore Naresh, for sharing your insights on this pertinent aspect. Clearly, there are many challenges surrounding this subject, but your arguments add a lot of clarity. We now divert the discussion to the subject of force structuring. Force structuring is very critical to a military, and specifically from a naval perspective, it is expensive and time consuming. Moving on to our third expert, Commodore Deshmukh. Commodore Deshmukh, how do you assess the Indian Navy in this domain? And what do you think should be the Indian Navy's force structure in the next decade?
Yeah, and thank you, Dras, for this honor. As we know, India has always had a vision of becoming a regional power, if not the global, and the maritime power is closely related to this ambition. To project the maritime power effectively, to have a credible deterrence, and act as a diplomatic tool to project the national interests, the blue water capability is absolutely must. Indian Navy has always strived to be a potent blue water force and has built its fleet structure accordingly. However, the budgetary constraints have always affected our plans, and we have to deal with much less while maintaining our operational readiness and the capabilities. When we are forced to deal with adversaries like China and Pakistan, as has been pointed out earlier, we are not left with many choices. If we compare PLA Navy and the Indian Navy fleet strengths, PLA Navy stands with a ratio of 3:1 in all spheres in its favor. Not a very comfortable situation to live with. I'm aware of the debates which go around of numbers against capabilities. But we need to understand that the numbers to have their merit. For example, to have 2 carrier task force, 3 aircraft carriers is a magic number. Capabilities of 2 aircraft carriers cannot meet the requirements. Same logic is applicable to other platforms. Thus, keeping the strength of a major adversary in mind and to maintain an effective edge, we need to have 3 aircraft carriers for task force, one each on the eastern and western seaboard, with appropriate mix of its aircraft. As we know, one aircraft would always be in refit. We positively need 2 landing platform docks or LPDs with the correct mix of helicopters, which would cover anti-submarine as well as attack. We also need adequate numbers of anti-submarine warfare frigates and the multi-role ships, destroyer with the surface-to-surface and surface-to-air weaponry, a potent tanker fleet of offshore patrol vessels, survey vessels, R&D vessels. Obviously, these need to be backed up by the strategic submarines with the capability to offer the triad of nuclear deterrence, conventional submarines with air-independent propulsion. This need also to be supported with the auxiliary craft like shallow water craft, fast patrol boats, fast attack crafts to take care of the threats from the shallow waters. As has been pointed out, building the fleet strength takes quite time. Thus, the planned construction and the induction is very crucial for Indian Navy. Accordingly, adequate budgetary allocations need to be made by the government in the interest of the national security, as well as Indian Navy has to prioritize its acquisitions to meet threat perceptions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commodore Deshmukh, for articulating your views. Expanding the debate on naval capabilities a little further, there are contrasting views about the necessity of a third aircraft carrier for India. And there are two schools of thought on this, and evidently you are in favor of the third aircraft carrier. A specific question to you: what are the main reasons for your viewpoint, and why do you think these aircrafts are important for the Indian Navy? What kind of capability do they offer?
Thank you, Divya, for this question. Firstly, we really need to know that national security can never be measured in terms of billions of dollars. Indian Navy has to configure its fleet strength based on the long-term threat perceptions and the related preparedness. We cannot ignore the fact that India's main adversary is China, and Indian Navy has to take into account the imminent threat and counter the same effectively. We know China has been building its aircraft carrier fleet for effective sea control in South China Sea as well as in Indian Ocean region. We have to counter that effectively. Secondly, we need to be concise of China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI for short. Under this project, China has pushed many of the India's neighbors into a big debt trap. It has also encircled India all around, to name Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Pakistan are covered by BRI. Also, the China and Pakistan economic corridor also has a threat which posed to India, which needs to be factored in. Nepal and Tibet are in turmoil. Now the Bhutan also is being coerced by China. We really need to be prepared for tackling this. Thirdly, we cannot ignore situation in Indo-Pacific region in general and the South China Sea in particular, which is vital for our economic well-being. For example, almost 200 billion US dollars trade of India passes through South China Sea. We need to keep in mind India's vision of having true blue water capabilities for power projections, which will be crucial in the coming days. To pose a credible deterrence, as well as to have effective sea control capabilities, availability of the third aircraft carrier seems necessary to my knowledge. I would like to quote the Chief of the Naval Staff on this subject, and I quote, "The navies are all about reach and substance. If you are a nation that is aspirational, if you want to become a 5 trillion economy, you have 1/5 of the world's population. If you want to do well, you have to go outward. For that, you require air power, and aircraft carriers are absolutely necessary," unquote. Similar views have also been expressed by Rear Admiral Mayer, currently Commander of Carrier Task Force, and I quote, "From the fighting Navy's perspective, I think it is imperative that we maintain our tactical and operational advantage that includes forward presence and lethality. But increasing lethality at range and at speed are the things that, quite frankly, we have not focused upon during the land wars. But when you talk about the maneuver capability of aircraft carriers. With the air wing, ranges beyond that, and the weapons that the aircraft carry, we are delivering significant reach into the battle space, unquote. I'm sure the views which have been expressed by the people who are controlling the operational capabilities of Indian Navy and other navies would prove the point. On this background, the necessity of the third aircraft carrier would be well understood, and of course, it needs to have its own potent aircraft fleet. Thank you.
Thank you, Commodore Deshmukh. You are right in pointing out that the capability of our adversaries, Pakistan and China, also have to be taken into account. And rightly said that national security cannot be measured in terms of money. There are no two ways about this, but the reality is a little more complicated, as also evident in Rear Admiral Mayer's perspective on fighting Navy. On this note, the first round comes to an end. Very upfront and compelling arguments by the three panelists. I'm sure many questions await you all in the question and answer round. I can already see a few on my screen. We now move on to the second round and we take the technology debate a step further here. And the first question is to Commodore Prakash. Commodore Prakash, in the previous round, you mentioned that you are a bit of a technology skeptic. Can you please elaborate on your apprehensions? And by discounting the technology factor, what does the Indian Navy depend upon for fighting the future wars?
Okay, Divya, lovely question. I will again take my answer under the overall theme of the today's session as to what do we do in the next 10 years, not what we've already been doing, how we are currently poised. Okay, now let me say this, that for 35 odd years, I have been a practitioner of maritime warfare, and I'm only a technology skeptic, not averse to technology. No, we must remember that warfare is an art. Science just supports it. Okay, we are not led on by the nose by science. Now, there is a question of informed analysis when it comes when you come to major things like national security. While the information required for that informed analysis is of all types, one very important element of that, at which we are not very great, is the study of history, specifically military history. Now, they say that while every good student of military history may not have been a great military leader, but every good military leader has been a good student of history. The growth of technology is a natural process driven by specific needs and or interests actually. Now, those who have the technological capability and specific needs will develop that technology they need and they will use it. Those who don't know what technology they want or know it, but they don't have the capacity to produce it, will get whatever they want, whatever they can get, and then they have to find uses for it. Now, Commodore Deshmukh spoke about force structuring. Now, force structuring can be done through capacity building or threat-based. There are two ways of approaching force structuring. Now, let's take a look at Pakistan and China, the closest adversaries. Now, Pakistan is blessed. How? He's got a definite geography. He's got a fixed enemy. And he's, if you consider the overall position of place of the Pakistani Navy in the Pakistani Armed Forces setup, they have, I'm sure, specific roles. So it is very easy for them to actually make a threat-based force based on these realities. Now, let's look at China. Chinese also had a definite geography, as long as their aspirations were limited to the China Seas, the East and the South China Seas. But then they are a revisionist country now. They are trying to expand their influence all over the world in various ways, and they would like to keep those aims safe, and so they can have now a different set of aims. Now, for which they are well poised to create capacities. They need a capacity-based growth, and luckily for them, they have an autocratic system that makes it possible to focus on whatever they want. Now, in our case, we are definitely not a revisionist country. We don't have expeditionary requirements. We have a very clearly enunciated area of interest, a clearly laid out roles for the Navy through a naval doctrine made by the Navy themselves, and a very widely acknowledged duty to maintain peace and good order in our region. Now, this calls for the creation of a force structure with capacity creation, because you create something for a specific threat and that threat doesn't get thrown at you, then you wasted that effort of yours. So we have to have capacity based force structuring at our core. But when money is short, it's a fact of life. History shows it that navies tend to restrict themselves to developing threat based force structures. That's the problem. When you make it threat based, when you actually need capacity based, you can get into trouble. Now, capacity-based force building creates, it takes time and resources. It takes a lot of effort, more time. So here, technology cannot be leading war fighting by its nose. We should be, it should be the other way around. Another point about technology is that there is so much promise that cyber warfare apparently holds. Similar is the case with space-based systems, artificial intelligence, autonomous systems. Now, how proven are these? We are aware of the massive cyber attack that the United States was subjected to recently, and that too for a long time. As per the government, US government public statement, it is the Russians responsible. President Trump says it is the Chinese. And the fun is that it's been going for so long, very serious levels, and the one to pipe up and finally say that they are under attack was a private agency. So much for the most modern technological country in the world, and so much for the safety, security of cyber systems and the amount of reliability we must place on it. Now, military history is a very rich resource, for force of lessons, and for instances wherein you put all eggs in the technology basket, and only to find that it didn't work out when you expected it. Now, nothing in this world can rise above principles of war, good military doctrine, quality human resource, and a well-trained military force. Technology is an enabler. It's not the reason it's not the reason why we are around. So that's the focus we must have for the next 10 years. Divya, to you.
Commodore Prakash, doubts regarding technology are well placed. This debate is never an easy one, but you make a compelling case to keep the military or the Indian Navy in general still manpower centric because morale matters. And in the previous round as well, you mentioned that while setting our goals, we shouldn't lose sight of reality. And it's rightly said because more so in issues concerning national security, we need to set realistic goals. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Revisiting the subject of force structuring, Commodore Deshmukh, you had spoken earlier about right force structure for the next decade. So, what, as per you, should be the areas in which the Indian Navy must concentrate, particularly in the field of weapons, sensors, and attributes of various platforms for operational competence?
Thank you, Divya. It's really a very complex question which needs to be analyzed based on our threat perception, our goals, and objectives. Certainly, no nation can build its navy or its capabilities without a clear-cut policy which matches with the national security. As Commodore Prakash said, it has to be a good balance between the capability-based growth and the threat-based perceptions matched growth. Thus, based on the current South China Sea situation, complications due to China-Pakistan economic corridor, India has to manage with its look east and act east policies, its emerging roles in the Indo-Pacific region, and participate in the Quad. We also have compulsions to engage with ASEAN and the BIMSTEC countries diplomatically, economically, and militarily. And for that, a strong naval force would be a prerequisite. India accordingly needs to have a very balanced fleet with appropriate weapons, sensors, and the support systems. I therefore feel that our future aircraft carriers need to be equipped with integral airborne early warning aircraft, fighter aircraft with air-to-surface and air-to-air capabilities, anti-submarine warfare helicopters, attack helicopters, search and rescue helicopters, and certainly unmanned air vehicles for the long surveillance, and a weaponized mode for taking care of small threats. The landing platform docks need to be equipped with anti-submarine warfare helicopters, both in the hunter and the killer mode. We need to have airborne early warning helicopters, multi-role helicopters, and search and rescue capabilities, which is commensurate with the roles and the vision of the Indian Navy. We also need to have the frigates and the destroyers with their integral air element, advanced weapons, which will take care of the surface to surface and surface to air capabilities, and anti-submarine warfare capabilities. We need to have tankers which are capable of supporting our long-range missions, because to project our maritime power, the long-range missions is going to be reality and not a dream. We need to have adequate auxiliary and the support vessels, which will take care of the various roles which a task force has to perform, and the task force own security will be taken care of. Our strategic submarines must have the inescapable second strike capability to provide a great deterrence. We need to have appropriate ICBMs, torpedoes as weapons, capable long-range sonars, and the towed array sonars, which has been missing, and it's a real capability what we need. We also need conventional submarines with air-independent propulsion, towed array sonars, and appropriate weapons like heavy, lightweight torpedoes and appropriate missile configurations. We need to have potent underwater autonomous vessels for the surveillance, attack, mine sweeping, mine laying duties, as well as the seabed survey as required. Importance of smart weapons like loitering missiles cannot also be ignored. We also need to keep in mind coordinated patrol requirements for anti-piracy and anti-terrorism operations. We need to have state-of-the-art coastal surveillance radars, shore batteries, radar signature monitoring facilities, and state-of-the-art degaussing facilities. Advanced sensors like state-of-the-art radars, sonars, infrared sensors, artificial intelligence-enabled sensors, etc., are needed for the effective utilization of the limited assets. I agree, as Commodore Prakash has said, that the technology has its limitations. So obviously, we need to have the trained manpower who will have the capability to overcome any cyber attacks as such and counter them. And we do have the systems to do that. Finally, we also need to be concise about the environmental protection. Some of the things we could consider are the use of advanced material in building our ships, sandwich plate systems, which are environmentally friendly, advanced communications, which help cost-effective deployment of the platforms. However, Divya, kindly do not ask me from where money would come from all this. As said, nation security cannot be measured in terms of rupees. Maybe on the lighter side, under Atmanirbhar Bharat, I would like to put a printing press where I could print a few dollars to help Indian Navy in acquiring the capabilities. Thank you so very much. And I would end by wishing a fine service with fair winds and following seas. Shanno Varna, Jai Hind.
Commodore Deshmukh, your concerns are valid and suggestions which you have made are very precise. Thank you for sharing your assessment. Unfortunately, the decision makers in Delhi asked exactly the same question which you asked. Where would the money come from? And now the concluding question for today's session for Commodore Naresh. Commodore Naresh, joint warfare is important, and lately India is taking major steps to reorient our structures to facilitate efficient joint warfare. How do you think that the network-based technology can contribute in joint warfare in the future?
Thank you, Divya. This is a very, very important topic, and I can be only briefly covered in this webinar. Network-centric warfare relies on computer processing power and network communications technology to provide shared information of battle space to the command. This shared awareness increases the synergy for command and control, resulting in superior and informed decision making and ability to coordinate complex military operations over long distances. As have been brought out by the fellow panelists, Indian Navy is a blue water navy. It has about 150 odd ships and more than 300 aircrafts, including aircraft carrier, a number of submarines. All these assets are far away from the Indian shores when operating at sea, right up to South China Sea, Indian Ocean regions, and on the west side. With low-flying, sea-skimming missile and hypersonic missile threats, the reaction time available for the platform to detect, track, and engage these targets has reduced over the years very considerably. And only an automated surveillance systems connected through wide area networks can handle the challenge. While I fully agree that all these technologies are enablers and add to the capabilities of the soldier who is fighting the war, there is no escape from adopting these technologies to fight today's warfare. As the three services have been upgrading their communication and command and control systems over last 3 decades, Navy has been the leader in network-centric warfare. Navy inducted its first fully computerized combat management system, IPN-10, in early 80s on board Godavari class ships. This system was a technology acquisition program where the naval officers, 9 of them, I happen to be one of them also, were sent to Italy for 2 years to understand, develop, and see how the computers can assist the war fighters in taking very crucial and critical decisions in matter of seconds. Because if you can imagine that if a sea-skimming missile like Exocet is fired at you, maximum range you can detect is about radar horizon, which is 40 kilometers. And before you can move, the missile will be at the ship. So all these challenges are addressed, including the warfighting doctrine, which is implemented as a computer program in these systems. Navy also took a very wise decision to immediately start the indigenous development of combat management system and data link for all future ships of the Navy. The main reason for this was that these systems cannot be bought from abroad because it contains the secrecy of your warfighting doctrine in the programs. In fact, during development of such systems, there were always fictitious data given by the Navy to these people so that they can develop the program. With growing role in the blue water, Navy also acquired a dedicated GSA-7 communication satellite through ISRO to connect all its ships, submarines, aircrafts, and shore stations, which is maritime operation centers, through the communication link. This is a major technological capability developed by the Navy, mainly at Weapon Electronics System Engineering Establishment, WESI at Delhi, Bharat Electronics, and recently Tata Power SED has also developed a similar system in the private sector. The UAV, which were essential for long-time surveillance, were not available with us and are still not developed by DRDO. Their Rustam program is still behind schedule. So Navy was left with no option but to buy the Heroine and other UAV systems from Israel in 2006. These systems have been giving you real-time video picture of the required surveillance area to the base ship which controls it. In the commanders conference, when I was Director of Information Technology at Naval Headquarters, I had pointed out at that time that the satellite communication is the core technology which Navy should have for network-centric operations. In fact, when the IPN-10 system was introduced into the Navy, the tactical data link, similar to Link 11, used by US forces and NATO countries, was ordered as a part of it. During the sea trials at sea, when I was on board Ganga, it was observed that our communication systems supplied by Bell and ITIs did not have the adequate bandwidth to transmit digital transmission. All the legacy warship communication systems were voice-based. Voice could still be transmitted through all UHF, VHF, and other channels, but high-speed data transmission, which is the necessity of digital systems, could not be handled by the communication systems at that time. Navy, of course, over the years, have upgraded all its communication systems and networking capabilities to data link to have network-centric warfare. The data link system is also developed by WESI with industry partnership and is akin to Link 16 being used by the US forces and NATO countries at present. Without command and control system and data link system and having a long haul communication system through satellites, it is not possible isolated from the rest of the world. Of course, with the disruptive technology which is coming in the way now, that is 5G and 6G technology, which China is the leader in the world to adopt. The new weapons and sensors will be operating at the edge of the backup network. They will have very high bandwidth to get the tactical picture and information of the battle scenario, which will be processed and assessed through the global internet-based 5G, 6G network technologies. And therefore, it is necessary that India masters the cybersecurity, master the cybersecurity technologies, and as and when we get 5G, we are far away from 5G, and 6G is, I heard to Dr. Paul Raj talk on 5G and 6G technology recently at Stanford. India is far, far behind in the communication technology arena of 5G, 6G to achieve the kind of bandwidth and network which is required for real-time transmission of very high bandwidth videos and similar pictures. So it is for us to see that we embrace these technologies. Even the software-defined radio, we read in the paper, so many guys are working on software-defined radio. But has the armed forces deployed a software-defined radio anywhere in our systems? As far my knowledge goes, it has not yet been deployed. Software-defined radio and high bandwidth systems will be absolutely essential for the network-centric warfare in the very near future because of jamming and other countermeasures which will be taken by our adversaries to disrupt our networks. It is therefore essential for Navy to keep pace with these new developments and upgrades its platforms and systems for unified communications and warfare. This is a technology which you cannot escape. And without this capability, we will not be able to match with the adversaries we have in our north. Thank you very much.
Commodore Naresh, thank you so much for explaining the nuances of joint warfare. No simple answers here, but we'll have to wind up this first session of 2021, and we have about 5 to 10 minutes to take up the questions. We have a few from our panel for our panelists in the chat box, and some of the young students had shared their questions with us in the email. So we'll take the first question, which has been addressed for Commodore Prakash. Commodore Prakash, you had initially mentioned that there are several examples from history with focus on technology alone, which had brought about failures. Can you please give an example? And I'll take up one more question, which has been asked to you by Commander Jaykrishnan. Are we looking for a military alliance with Quad nations in the coming decade? And how would it benefit India? I request you to be precise because we are already overshooting. Commodore Prakash.
Yeah, okay. I've just heard you. I'll finish in 3 minutes, both the questions. Firstly, the first part you asked me about history. Now, with what I'm going to speak, I think the contrast of with what I'm saying and the pro-technology people, it's going to become wider. Now, what I'm going to tell you is the essence of my lectures, which I've given at the National Defense College, war colleges, CDM, etc. Now, it's called the effect of prolonged peace. It's a study of the British Navy from 1805 to 1914. Now, what happened in 1805? In 1805, under the leadership of Nelson, they beat the combined fleets of Spain and France. But the leadership of Nelson was not there actually because he got shot in the beginning of the battle and lay dying at the bottom of the ship. Now, these 33 ships fought a superior 41 ship Franco-Spanish fleet, and at the end of the day, all 33 ships survived, and the Franco-Spanish fleet lost half their ships, 22 ships, and about 16,000 people injured or dead, whereas the British had hardly anything. It's like, say, the Indian football team, scoring 10 goals against Italy or something like that. Now, why did that happen? Because in the previous 75 years of 1805, the British were fighting wars for 50 years. Now, you play golf, well, every day you become a good golfer. Now, they were actually the epitome of operational effectiveness in this world. They were the benchmark. Now, thereafter, Britain becomes a superpower, and for the next 110 years, British Navy doesn't have to fight any other war. And in this 110 years of peace, they also have 3 lovely things going for them. They have industrial revolution at its peak. So that means technology, they had resources like India, and their political stability. Queen Victoria ruled for 64 years. So they had lovely things: peace, technology, resources, and political stability. And when the First World War came, the British Navy we could technically say we're the best Navy in the world, but they had forgotten one small thing. They had forgotten how to fight. And if the Americans had not pitched in, our history would have been different. Now, why did that happen? That is because in long years of peace, empirical memory fades, and all kind of rationalist theory takes over. Technology comes in, and at that time it was communications which came in, and communications became, it's tremendous all over the place. And the communicator said that we are going to win the war for you, but it didn't happen. Absolutely, it failed. Extrapolating later, in 1982, in the Falklands War, it's only when, again, they had a long period of peace, the British. It's only when superintendents of the Argentine Air Force fired exocet missiles at British ships in Falklands, and they got hit. That is when they realized that there were problems in low-flying targets being engaged by their anti-missile missiles. Now that's what happens. In peace, it all looks very good from glossies, but but only when you have conflict, you can figure out what is actually wrong. So in long years of peace, technology looks excellent, but may not work. As come to Naresh said, it took an actual event for the Indian Air Force to figure out that they need secure communication. Come on. Okay. Now, having said that, that's the first question. Second is about Quad. Now, actually, we have this a mindset of say NATO and Quad being safe. NATO was born out of a shared war, and they saw the importance of actually protecting people who are contiguous to each other and which are ideologically based against, say, communism. Now, for a Quad, a setup like Quad, which is only one commonality that you have a common enemy, or maybe that we are all for democracies, may not be good enough. So I have my own doubts about that. With the Americans actually showing, what in their own internal troubles with democracy, I really wonder about that second part also, as to the four democracies being four democracies. That's it.
Thank you, sir. Next is a question under remark by Sumana from JNU, and she says that the Indian armed forces, including the Navy, are not yet as technologically equipped and advanced. And extrapolating from the US side, Delhi's report on troop morale in the army, it would be safe to assume that the situation isn't as promising for the Navy also. So, given the state of troop morale and technology, what should be the focus of Indian Navy in its maritime strategy? I'll also take with it a comment from Rajneesh Joshi in the audience. The elaborate requirement of technology, which is required as suggested by Commodore Deshmukh, is truly the need of the day. It's important that technology is taken into account, but there is an important financial constraint. And a lot of other scholars also in the audience have asked that how do you manage this financial constraint along with your requirements? And mixing it with the last question from Sagarika from Jamia Millia, she says, does India have a proper naval doctrine or a military doctrine to guide and predefine the role of the forces? These are open questions. Any one of you could take it, and we'll wind up with this.
Divya, may I take a part which is related to the technology and the fund requirement?
Oh, sure.
I fully appreciate and understand the concern that looking at it, our armed forces look not matching the technology levels of our adversaries. However, it is very important to note that the planners, whether they are in the ministry, they are in the government, or at the helm of affairs at the service headquarters, are fully seized of the requirements as they are emerging. We keep analyzing what is happening around, what is not happening, and we keep upgrading our own equipment, strategies, and the tactical requirements within the given constraints of the budget. For example, we cannot look into a thing that this is what I need and this is what is the money available. Taking on the question whether there will be a military alliance with the Quad for India and how India will benefit from it. Side by side, the question also needs to come in mind that with India's stature going up with the Quad, with improvement in our relations with Vietnam, Indonesia, as the Asian countries, the BIMSTEC, and our proactive actions related to Bhutan and Nepal, as well as the Americans' push, what is happening? Russia is being driven closer to China, and the possibility of a military pact between Russia and China is a real possibility. Now, if that is going to happen, will it be necessary for India to have a military pact with the Quad and other countries is the question which needs to be understood and addressed. If that happens, and if South China Sea conundrum really boils over, affecting the economies of ASEAN, BIMSTEC countries, India, US, Japan, and Australia, all these forces will have to be pulled together, and obviously technology will play a great role into this. So we will collaborate, cooperate, and address the technological needs as well as the financial constraints. But be rest assured, Indian Navy will not be found wanting in fighting an adversary and teaching him a lesson. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. With this, the question and answer round comes to an end. It was a very interesting session. And before I request Anna to render the vote of thanks, I request Vice Admiral Muralidharan to sum up the deliberations for all of us. Over to Admiral.
Thank you very much, Divya. At the outset, let me compliment all the three panelists so forcefully bringing out. They covered an entire range from operations to technology to force level planning, etc., in such a short span of time. Let me say, I think what some of the panelists said it, but let me enforce a few things for the rest of the audience here, especially our young students who are there. Now, as far as navies are concerned, when you talk of a 10-year perspective, there's really nothing you can do, because what you got to do in the next 10 years, you used to have planned 10 years ago. Because the naval perspective plans is 15, 20, 25 years. Now, in this, I would say that when we got independence from a virtually coastal small boat navy, because the Royal Navy did not want any of the other their states, like countries like India, to develop a major navy that could challenge them. So from that level, by 1961, Indian Navy had an aircraft carrier, probably the first at that time in Asia, because Japan had given up on aircraft carriers. After the war, China had still not developed what it is. And it was a full-fledged power-packed navy with destroyers, frigates, aircraft carrier, shore-based aircraft, etc., that had been planned, and we were coming in. And that was because you had the vision. Again, I would say, to interject here, that as I think Prakash brought it out very well, that we got to plan develop a navy based on our overall threat perceptions and what is our larger requirement for the nation to safeguard our security. It is from that perspective. It should not be purely, based on what force structure I should have. It should not be the pure, threat. It should not be what capability or capacity should I have. What is your overall plan of the Navy? What do you want a Navy to be? For example, as far as India is concerned, we are a maritime trading nation. Do you want a force level which can look after your trading and maritime interests to safeguard their interests? Now we have interests right from, in oil, we have invested off the coast of between the Far East of Russia. We have somewhere else coming up in the, we are looking at South America. We are looking at the other coast of Africa. So you need your force levels which can appear in time to protect your interests. Going back in history, it's the old gunboat diplomacy sort of thing, where your forces appear, you are posing a credible threat. It's a simple thing to put it in simple terms. Why do you need that one policeman standing at a traffic junction? Just the presence of that man gives the rest of the people, the traffickers, that yes, somebody is monitoring us. The effect is not so much if you are monitoring by satellite, or if you tell a chap, there are cops who put cameras all over, you can get fined. It doesn't affect him. But seeing that single cop makes, so whether we can put one ship in the South China Sea, whether you can put one deep into the Atlantic, one near the Antarctic, one near the Arctic, makes a difference. So what we need, so your force level has to be developed on those levels. And I must very much caution the young practitioners here, let us not get taken up by jargons. You find a lot of things now today coming in the media: theater command, cyber warfare, technology-driven navy. All these are all technologies purely an enabler. It is not to, like you go and buy. You look at these fellows advertise, again, to put in simple terms, motor cars and two-wheelers. Now, I recently heard an advertisement of a two-wheeler saying that, yes, it has got, what is that, Bluetooth enabled and all that. Now, when you're driving a two-wheeler, are you going to be listening to music or this thing, or you're going to focusing on the road? Because in a car, music comes behind. It doesn't matter. It's a four-wheeler, you got stability. Now, if you're going to be listening to something like that, so that is why, just because that technology is available, should I get it? Should Navy get it? No. And navies all over, right from historic times, have been actually the enablers of technology coming in for it. So we have also done that. We need to upgrade our technology, make our force level plan as what we need to do. So these are things that you must keep in mind. And there are times that you need to develop. You look at how Admiral Gorshkov developed the Soviet Navy from scratch. After World War II, he realized the importance of maritime forces. He didn't go in for carriers initially. He went because you can imagine Soviet Union is spread all over. He can have just from a shore based, he can launch at strikes in the Atlantic. He can strike strikes in the Pacific, in South China Sea, whatever they need. The northern side, Arctic, he could do what he wanted. So he developed submarines and nuclear vessels to go and tackle the American forces, catch them where it is. He had long range weapons, aircraft, surveillance, etc. So I see what we need to do, to put in simple terms, what we call as maritime domain awareness. You got to know what all is happening where, then you can take action. And unfortunately, what happened is while we were planning all this, the 62 war came in, and then the 65 war came in. So we got bound to our borders, and we were not a very rich country at that time. You had so many other needs for the nation. People were starving. So the money that could come to the armed forces and especially to the Navy was limited. But hopefully now with our economy improving, but money will never be enough. Even the US Navy or the Germans, the Japanese, the British, no naval forces are getting the kind of money that they need, but we need to do it. And also, finally, somebody asked that question about, we have a naval, we have a vision for the Navy. We want to know, we have full plans, how it's being developed, etc. Because ultimately, if you remember, again, an example, how the Vietnamese with limited forces beat the Americans. American Navy got stuck because somebody thought that let me put a few mines in various places. It happened in the Gulf War. One mine attack and everything happened. They used a small vessels with a charge to go and ram the vessel with explosives. That got everybody stuck. So these are all imponderables that come in. And unlike the Navy, Army or the Air Force, which is where you need ground presence, where you need to hold the land, and you can't go and operate from somebody else's land until you have. Navies have the advantage that you're operating international waters. You can put your force levels down. So that is what matters to you. Why do you think China is trying to get in? Because he was not that strong enough. He was looking at forces all over the place to develop bases. Whereas we have the thing. So I'm sure, I think today's session would have, as a big eye opener. And I must once again say the panelists have given us a full overview of the technologies that are available, and what we need to do and how we are going to do it is something for the naval planners. And I think the perspective plans cover all that. Thank you, Divi.
Thank you, Vice Admiral Muralidharan, for your great summing up and your comments on this discussion. Indeed, India has always been a maritime nation. Our history has been shaped by the Indian Ocean, and it continues to do so. We had a very valuable discussion today about the need to upgrade our Navy, the need to have network-centric warfare, force structuring, and the likes. And we also had very valuable comments which said that above every technology is the ability to fight, and how we do that well is what will define how we do navally as a nation. We are extremely honored to have all our panelists tonight: Commodore Naresh Kumar, Commodore S.L. Deshmukh, and Commodore G. Prakash. Thank you so much, sirs, for being here, for your valuable comments. It was a pleasure listening to this extremely value-adding debate today. I would also like to thank Divya Malhotra for conducting this session today, and Nikita Vats for her introduction and being there. I would love to thank all our senior advisors, our research fellows, our guests here who've joined us. Thank you for being here, and please be with us as we go through this year, hopefully with many more sessions to come. Last but not the least, I would like to thank from all of us, Commander Jaykrishnan Nair, for coordinating this and giving us the opportunity to put this webinar together today. Thank you, sir, for your support and coordination. And lastly, a big thank you to Defense Research and Studies for giving us this platform as young researchers to listen to such valuable opinions, such insightful opinions, and enriching our knowledge about maritime affairs. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Hopefully, we'll have your esteemed presence in the future as well. With this, let's call it a day. Jai Hind. Thank you for being here. Good night.
Thank you very much.